Hello, world. I'm your host, Max Patton, and this is Dreaming Polygons, the podcast where we explore the games industry and where it's headed by interviewing the voices and perspectives shaping its future, one polygon at a time. Today I'm talking to Alyx Jones, a game music composer who's experimenting with procedural audio and integrating that with new ways of telling stories in games, as well as making her own narrative exploration game based on her traumatic childhood and early life. Let's see what she has to say. Hello, everyone. I am with Alyx right now. Hello.
Hey.
Hey, thanks for coming on the show. As we start with all our guests, I want to ask you your story of how you got into games from a personal perspective. What made you realize that you could contribute to games, and when was that moment for you?
It's a weird one because I have the side of it that's games and the side of it that's music. So I grew up playing games to some extent. We had a Game Boy, and then when I was a bit older we got a PlayStation, and so games like Pokemon and Harry Potter and kind of classics from the 90s and the noughties I connected with a lot, and I had quite a rough childhood, and so being able to escape to those games was something that was really important in kind of surviving that. And the same goes for music in a way, of getting into rock music and all that kind of stuff is a really good coping mechanism of getting through life. But it wasn't till I was at university maybe that I really thought that it was a job that I could do, because growing up no one said, oh, you can work in the games industry, that's a thing. It wasn't really a thing as far as I know, and it was never told.
And what do you think was the moment that you realized that games and music could intersect for you and that you could create for that?
Yeah, I don't know when I started becoming aware of the fact that music in games was important. It just kind of was always there, and I guess it's something that you spend so long playing all your favorite games, the soundtracks become so much a part of that. But I think in university, because I was lucky enough to go to the University of Surrey, which is in Guildford, so it's surrounded by a lot of games companies and a kind of culture with independent developers and game jams and stuff like that. So I was able to jump into it as a student, and then I realised that all these people are doing these jobs, and it's something that I can be a part of.
When it comes to music in games, what do you think the significance of that is? Like in film and television, music has been employed for quite a while, and games are such a new medium that we're still experimenting with it. So, what do you think the role of music for games is?
I mean, I think the role is still the same, of creating an emotional journey, or pushing your players in a way that you want them to feel, or helping support the storyline. But there's the added element of the fact that it's non-linear, so it changes all the time, and the player's in control of what happens with the gameplay and then what happens with the music in turn. So when you're watching a film, you can't change how the film turns out, you just have to sit and experience it as intended. Whereas with games, you have completely procedurally generated games that have music that goes alongside that, and it can be really different. So in that sense, it can almost have a role of creating something really new and almost unique to you.
Yeah, and I think there's also like a length thing, because if you think about it, like a movie or a show is going to last at most 2 hours, whereas a game, even the shortest of games, are usually like 3 hours, right? And a lot of them, an RPG or something, can stretch to tens or hundreds of hours, which makes music, I think, really important in the sense that it can't be too repetitive or annoying. It has to catch the right atmosphere. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, it's a really hard one because you want kind of a motif or something to hang off that people remember and come back to, but then it's really hard to find the balance between playing it enough for them to remember, or too much that they're like, right, this is really annoying now.
Right. You've worked on a lot of experimental games and game jams and games that are really doing new sort of things. What attracts you to the field of independent games that are specifically, breaking boundaries and storytelling in new ways? What makes that special for you?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of affinity towards people who struggle with mental health issues, and had quite a tough upbringing myself, and these kind of stories aren't necessarily told in really big budget games, so having that element to relate to for people who are going through similar things was one of the main things, just because it purely makes you feel less alone, but also because I'm quite a creative person, and I like to explore things and try things out, even if they don't work and they're not something, it's not a product you would sell, but it's something that you've tried out and is really cool. So that's probably why.
Yeah, it's interesting because you see in mainstream media, I mean, it still happens to where games are portrayed as, violent or harmful in that way because people mainly focus on big budget games, whereas what you see in the more independent sector is usually more artistic and usually can have a lot of positive benefits too. I mean, games of all kinds can, right? Like you said, with mental health and helping people cope through difficult times in the real world, being a form of escapism, and even, what we see today with charity streams and all sorts of things like that. What do you think is important when it comes to games intersecting with the real world from your experience?
Well, I think because games are made by us, there always is going to be that connection because we can't get away from who we are and our experiences. And we only really put those experiences into the games that we make. So, however abstract they are, there's still something that someone can connect to, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of the work you've done for music and games is experimenting with procedural music, right?
Yeah, as much as possible.
Right. And for those who don't know, what does that really mean?
It's kind of music that in the same way that in games they might have systems that determine how characters might behave or how enemies react to certain things, the same that you want that to happen with the music. So it can be music that is built off a very small sound palette, or you can build it off a really large one. It depends how much you want it to sound like your music, or whether you're willing to let computers kind of decide what happens with it. So it can be completely randomly generated, or it can be somewhere in between. So you might feed it certain motifs or key signatures or chord patterns, and then the computer can decide which section of that it plays.
Because I think we're increasingly realizing for games that like you can't just stick an audio file anymore and play that like in order anymore. Because that's not really the only way people experience games. Like we mentioned before with length and other things, music kind of has to adapt. And it's done that for a while, but what do you think are the steps it's taking now to do that even more so than it was before?
It's quite a difficult thing between it sounding random and people not being able to connect to it because they're used to stuff that we hear in the charts or other soundtracks that you listen to, or even some people miss like loop music because the repetition becomes so familiar that creates that emotional bond. And so really random AI music isn't appealing to people either, so we have to try and mix them together in a way that works for games.
And specifically in games, one of your more recent projects is Elise Unpainted Memories, which is this puzzle narrative game that you're working on with Skyfish. For those who don't know, can you quickly describe that game and what you think the role of the music in it is going to be for the experience?
So the game is kind of a tile swapping game in the sense that you have to take your character and progress them through a path from A to B to get through the game, but you have to move pieces of the screen around essentially to make her able to get through. But it's very hand drawn and painterly kind of aesthetic, and she's quite a kind of delicately drawn character, so I didn't want to like overpower anything, and I used the piano as the main instrument to represent Elise. But I also work a little bit with creating kind of soundscapes crossed over with music and letting the kind of however far you're progressing in the puzzle determine how much of that is being played. But I didn't want it to be overly driven in the way that sort of modern games would have like exploration music and then combat music when an enemy is close. I didn't want it to be like really obviously like you've solved the puzzle now, well done. I wanted it to kind of evolve and represent the kind of environment that she's exploring.
So more kind of smoothly integrate and transition in accordance with the gameplay?
Yeah, but I wanted to play with it and see how far it can go with the random elements before it becomes unpleasant.
And you yourself are working on a project called The Quiet Things, which is an autobiographical narrative game about your life. What inspired you to do that, and how is that going?
I've been through a lot in my short life as it is already, and I always kind of thought I wanted to write a book about it or something like that because I'd never known anyone to go through the experiences that I had. So I kind of felt quite lost while I was going through it. Whereas if I'd had like a buddy or a mentor or someone that had written about it, then I would have been like, oh, I'm not so alone. Like I can get through this. But I don't know if I'm that good at writing, but then I realised that I could kind of make games, so I thought that was a really perfect way to explore the way of expressing that and telling that story, but it's very personal and it's a bit different to normal games that you might play.
And how would you say it's different?
It's quite like blunt about things, and I don't sugarcoat anything. It's in the sense that I'll like deal with kind of domestic violence or like mental health, like depression, anxiety, or like suicidal feelings without it being part of some kind of hero storyline. Like it's just the very human side of it and the real life that lots of people experience.
Yeah, and it's a sensitive topic that games have dealt with traditionally quite poorly. I think last year Hellblade came out. That was mostly well received for portraying mental illness. Do you think is that like a model you're following, or are you doing something entirely new?
Yeah, for that game, I think they explored psychosis quite a lot and the kind of like hearing of voices, but they did the really incredible thing of using like binaural sound and having like their actors moving around a mic as the voices would have done, like in your head. So it sounds really incredible. But I don't know what what model it would be, to be fair. Like I think they treat the topic sensitively, but it's also not about that. It's kind of about something quite fantastical, and the main point of the story is kind of more within these Celtic mythology rather than that she has a mental illness. They just kind of use that as part of her character.
It happens to be part of her character, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, whereas in your game, it's much more at the center of things because it's your personal experience, not a fantastical story.
yeah, sure.
What do you think that's going to be like in terms of developing? Are you working with other people? Are you still planning it out? At what stage in that process are you at?
Yeah, so I finished a prototype and I went to like local exhibitions and stuff just to get people playing it. And it was really well received actually, but I want to do a lot more with it than there currently is. And it's because it doesn't really have like a main mechanic, like it's based off more of a walking simulator kind of genre than a gameplay mechanic. So I want to maybe add more puzzle elements to it. But I don't know, I'm just kind of exploring how it goes. And I work with a couple of other people, but more like for advice than proper working relationships.
Right. With the walking simulator genre, we've always seen that music is really good. Like Dear Esther, What Remains of Edith Finch, they're all games that use music really well. And I think that's a big part of their ambience. And I imagine your plans are similar with your game.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a lot to live up to. I don't know if I would manage that.
Well, the same style, though. Like,
Yeah, I think my game was compared quite a lot to Life is Strange in the elements of kind of, I don't know, like shoegazy guitars and quite, like I use lyrics because that was something that I did when I was younger to express myself, but lots of games don't actually use lyrics that much, and it's more of a like Japanese anime trend than it is in video games. There's much more like orchestral soundtracks that don't have words, like
mhm.
a little bit in Skyrim, but it's not anything you can understand either.
Right. A lot of it's limited to like the blockbuster style action music or it's ambient music of some kind, but usually games shy away from lyrics because it's viewed as too distracting.
Yeah,
But you think it's going to enhance the atmosphere for your game.
I think so. Yeah, the only problem I come across is if there's any narrative, I have to make sure that there's no lyrics bumping into that. But I don't know. I like it as a way of connecting the player to it, and I think like Life is Strange use the band Dulce to compose a lot of their music, and they use lyrics, and it works really well. And I think there's no reason why it can't be used in games.
Yeah, definitely. It's something we need to explore more. It's a hard process of figuring out how to make that work with gameplay and not be distracting, but if done well, it can have really great effects. I want to talk about diversity, and you're an advocate for women in games. Can you explain that briefly and what you view as the importance of that?
I think it's just that women make up quite a small amount of the industry compared to men, and actually in game audio specifically, it's less than 10%
Wow.
women versus like 90 odd percent men, which is kind of, I don't know, you think it's too big of a gap that you can accept really because you can't find the reasons why. If you look back at if you ever were in any music education, you actually probably weren't taught about women composers at all. And like on our GCSE curriculum in England, it's only very recently that they've made it compulsory to have to include female composers, because you learn about like Mozart and Beethoven and all sorts. And it wasn't till I was at university, and probably my second year of university, that I was like, oh, I don't even know how to name a female composer. Like, that's really shocking.
Huh. It is kind of sad. And it's something, I guess, that we have to get better at. Diversity is something that's talked about a lot now. But what do you think specifically in audio design? Like, what's the benefit of it, right? A practical benefit? Because a lot of people, they see it negatively, right? They see it like, oh, what's the point of this? This is just needless. What do you think is the value of that gained perspective and that gained experience when you have people from more backgrounds?
Well, it's just a kind of common sense thing, is the more people from different walks of life that you incorporate, the more people that you appeal to. And that goes for any discipline, whether it's programming, art, music, whatever, because if you're just looking at a smaller subsection of people, then they're going to be the target audience kind of naturally, because you're creating games that you would probably play.
Yeah, and that's true because I mean that's why I think gaming has a stigma of being for men usually or for boys. I mean, usually for young teenagers, that's the stereotype. Just because that's the audience that grew up making games a lot of the time, almost exclusively, just because of social dynamics. And it hasn't really changed from that until like the last decade or so. At least at a level that's large enough that we're finally seeing an impact, I think.
When I was growing up, at least, it was considered a boys' thing, but I was kind of more of a tomboyish kind of girl, so I embraced that as someone who liked boys' things. But it wasn't until I was kind of older that I became more feminine, and then I already had that gaming experience from being like that, and so I thought, oh, there must be a way for it to appeal to women more as well.
Yeah. Looking towards the future, where do you see it going? What do you see yourself doing beyond your game? Do you want to work on more indie projects? Do you want to work on more theoretical and abstract things? What do you want to do with music and games?
I mean, I love working on things that I never would have thought I worked on. So like really like abstract projects, or even something like installations, or like a crossover between like a game and an installation. There's a thing in London called London's Games Festival, and they have Now Play This, which is part of that, and all of their video games are kind of practical hands-on games, so they're all like installations. And so there's people running around rooms and talking to each other, and there's like music involved. Like, it's really amazing. But that would be something that I'd quite like to explore more. But I think the more experimental you want to be, the less money there is traditionally in it.
Yeah, but at the same time, we have like a virtual reality, right? And that's like a buzzword kind of thing. So there's interest in that, right? I feel like there is a lot of interest in, you could have a museum exhibit with an installation and kind of attract it, saying, oh, virtual reality or something like that, because that's kind of something that's resurged recently,
Yeah, that's true. You can get funding for things if they sound cool.
right? I mean, that's just a eternal truth, but there's a lot of cool stuff going on right now between that augmented reality.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting era for music, because when it becomes augmented reality, then you don't necessarily want a soundtrack blasting all over the place, because you want to be able to hear the real world, because it's implemented into it. So that's still something that's being explored quite a lot, I think.
I read something somewhere that like headphones are the first example of augmented reality invading our lives. And I'm not sure I agree with that because you're kind of overriding it with headphones.
Yeah.
But with the noise canceling stuff that headphones are doing, and I don't know, it's interesting. Like I imagine a future where games maybe can augment your audio. I think there was this app on phones called Zombies Run that was like a running app where it told a story about a zombie apocalypse and it integrated the narrative into an exercise app. So you would run from the zombies and you'd hear them coming closer and you do missions and stuff. I think it'd be really interesting to see more of that.
Yeah, I think one of the drawbacks is that, because binaural audio is what sounds really amazing, and it makes you look over your shoulder because it sounds like it's really there, like it's really incredible.
Right.
But the processing power required to do that is quite high, so it wouldn't be like mobile, like for example, and they often have to bake the location of the sounds, so you can't move them. Whereas in augmented reality, you need to be able to look around and the sounds stay where they are in the 3D world. So I guess that's what is going to get explored next, and the next hurdle for people to get over.
Traditional microphones and stuff probably aren't optimized for capturing that kind of sound.
Yeah, so you need probably a dummy head recording, which is where you put microphones inside the ears of this dummy head, and you'd record it from that. But there's also the problem that is kind of a template head, so it doesn't suit everybody exactly the same. So what you hear is not exactly the same as what someone else hears.
Yeah, maybe we'll have to mathematically alter it to change depending on a person's dimensions and things.
Yeah, so there's a thing called head related transfer functions, which you would try and measure individual people's ears.
Sounds complicated, but really cool at the same time. Thank you again so much for coming on and for telling us a little bit about the sound and experience of games, because it's a thing that people hear a lot, but they don't think about enough. So it's good that we had you on.
Oh, you're very welcome.
And if people want to find out about what you're doing, your game, follow you, where can they do that?
On Twitter, on my website, on Facebook, I'm pretty much everywhere. It's just Alyx Jones spelled with a Y.
Sure, and those will be linked in the description. Thank you again for coming on, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thanks so much for having me. Bye!
That's it for now. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, feel free to rate us on Apple Podcasts or leave a like on YouTube. You can subscribe to us in basically every podcast app and on YouTube as well. There's also Twitter, which you will want to follow to stay updated and new episodes of the show. Our Twitter is @PolygonsFM. Everything will be linked in the description in case you didn't catch it. Thank you so much for listening to the end of our 5th episode, and I will see you with a new guest next week. Until then, goodbye, world.